All right, hello everybody. Today I've got something for you that should be very, very quick. I'm going to be talking for a moment about a technique that I observed in this book called The Massacre of Mankind by Stephen Baxter. It is an official sequel to The War of the Worlds, not to belittle any of the unofficial sequels that came out after H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds back in the day. But this one was written in 2017, I believe. And so it's kind of it's got some fun points. There's a lot of there's a lot of scientific knowledge that had to be unlearned by Stephen Baxter, so to speak, in order to write this book, because he tried very hard to go back to the understanding of cosmology and the planets that we had back at the time of H.G. Wells' writing of the original book. So the purpose of this video is not a full review of that book. If you want to hear a full review of The Massacre of Mankind by me and my friend Justin, you can go check us out at the Wordy Pair. There is a Wordy Pair podcast episode that's about this book, and we kind of go over it in detail with some, humorous commentary and such. But there's one very specific thing I wanted to talk about I figured would make a good topic for a very short video. And that is the tendency in the first few chapters of this book for Stephen Baxter to name drop. He name drops a ton of places and things and objects and settings and things. And in general, these things are not developed in any significant way. In fact, we'll even see in one particular case that is developed incorrectly, which is also something that people need to watch out for. So for the purposes of writing technique, here's what I'm talking about. Name dropping, as I'm using it here, is the use of famous or specific names of places or things, often done in like alternate history or historical books, to say, oh, I was at this place in London or this place in Germany or whatever. The real names of cities. And even in fiction, even in pure fiction, if you're going to drop the name of a particular place, generally speaking, you should explain somewhere between a couple of words to a couple of sentences about why that place is, or why that particular name is important. So I'm just going to go through a short list of some of the names that get dropped in the first few chapters of The Massacre of Mankind, and then I'll get to what I'm talking about. So we have the Woolworth Building, Roman and Byzantine mosaics, Tammany Hall, the Plaza Hotel, Freud, the Lusitania, the Titanic, the Elephant and Castle area of London, the Barbican, the Clyde, the Forth, and the Grangemouth, Loch Lomond, Waterloo Bridge, Covent Garden, Charing Cross Road, Trafalgar Square, Arthur Conan Doyle. All of these things are mentioned in the first two chapters of Massacre of Mankind, and they're done so in a rather blithe way. Is blithe the right word? They're done in a way where no details are given about these things, which makes it just sound like typical like social name dropping. Like, oh, I was talking with such and such person, and name dropping is when a person does this, and they're like, oh, well, I'm associated with this person whose name you've heard on TV or whatever, right? Only Baxter is doing it with the names of places and objects, settings, basically. In general, if you introduce a name, especially if you're doing it in this way where it's a name that you're expecting the reader to have heard before, right? You probably should try to find a way to insert somewhere, maybe not right there, but nearby, anywhere from a few words to a couple of sentences explaining what that thing is, or why it's significant, or why it has that name, or why the character noted that it was called that, right? Like, if you're just walking around random streets in London, you might say, oh yeah, I walked down this big road, and then I turned left and I went up here. And you might, if you don't care what those roads are, if you don't care about their significance, you might not say, oh yeah, I walked down the Strand to Charing Cross Road, and, I did this and did that, right? If you're going to drop the names, then there should be a little bit of a reasoning why they're there. Some of the names that he drops, he does a little bit better than others. For instance, he mentions the Plaza Hotel, and I think the purpose of him mentioning the Plaza Hotel is that it was a very well-known as a luxurious hotel at the time. And so he's saying, yeah, we've got nice digs here, basically. Okay, fine. He mentioned the Lusitania and the Titanic because this reason I kind of don't like is that he's like, oh, it's alternate history. These ships didn't sink. And it's like, okay, we get it. Thank you. Right? Like, what are the chances that the person in this book actually took the Lusitania, and mentioned the Titanic? I mean, if the Titanic didn't sink, then why mention it? Well, if they mention it because it almost hit an iceberg, it's like ships did that all the time. It's a little bit weird. It's a little bit jarring to me. I don't know about you, but that's the way I see it. He's mentioning all these places in London, and if he mentions the Elephant and Castle area of London, that's great. And a person from London might be like, "Ooh, I caught that reference." But there are types of writing where you're going to assume that your audience knows relatively intimately the details of the names that you're dropping. For instance, if you were writing a review of a concert, right? Then you're going to be talking about all these big name bands that got together, and your audience is going to be people who, either went to that concert or were interested in going to that concert, and therefore they know the names of the bands. And so you would say, well, this band did this, and this band played this, and then there was an intermission, and then this band played this. And you'd expect people to get these names, and in that case, you can kind of, you can kind of get away with name dropping a little bit more. I mean, if you're writing a review, then you're obviously going to be putting in details, so maybe that's not the best analogy. Maybe if you were writing like a little story, not even a story, but like a little discussion about, a walk that you had or something like that, where it's going to go into like a limited audience situation, or like a circular that goes around your community. Then you could say, yeah, I walked up street X, and I walked and I turned down to street Y, and I noticed that there was some litter, and so that's why you are all familiar with these two streets, and so we need to maybe deal with this litter problem. Like, there are reasons to do this, to name drop when your audience is narrow. But if you're aiming for a broad audience, as I assume a sequel to the freaking War of the Worlds is aiming for a broad audience, then your name drops should be accompanied by a little bit of description for people who don't know what you're talking about. Otherwise, it just sounds like name dropping. It sounds like, oh yeah, I met this guy, and I met, this guy, and you've heard of them. But it's a little bit jarring, and a little bit, it makes you feel kind of the same way that a person name dropping to you in real life does too. It's like, yeah, I get it. You're familiar with places in London. So, and there's even something funny in this particular book, because I'm not sure if this was done intentionally to show that it's alternate history again, which you only need to, I get it, right? One little hint is, maybe two, is good. In this one, there's a passage where, here, I'll read it. Once across the river, we walked along the Strand a distance and cut up through Covent Garden. Yada, yada, yada. There's a little bit of description here of Covent Garden, but it's not really particularly relevant to Covent Garden. It's just showing that there's heroes of the new military government. And then there's some internal monologue from the character. And then the next place they go, we walked along the Strand a distance and cut up through Covent Garden. And then the next place that they end up at is at Trafalgar Square. Now, when I was doing the research for this episode, I looked up some of the names that were dropped, and I actually went and checked out a map of that area of London. Well, it turns out that if you're walking along the Strand and you cut up through Covent Garden, you're actually going away from Trafalgar Square. And so in this case, it doesn't even make sense. Again, it might be that this is another element of the alternative history, but if you're going to the point of alternative history where things are named the same but arranged differently on the map, that can be very confusing. So, yeah, I think that's basically the point I want to get across. Number one, when I read books or stories or whatever that name drop a bunch of places of proper nouns, right? and don't describe them at all, it gives me an uneasy feeling, like I'm missing something. Number two, if you do this as a writer and you don't have the correct audience, if you're aiming for a wide audience that may not know each of these places, in intimate detail, then you're going to sound like you're just name-dropping famous people's names, right, that you've met, right? And number three, if you're going to name-drop these details, make doubly sure that they're actually accurate, or you might want to consider changing the names a little bit. If you're doing like an alternative history where, oh yeah, Trafalgar Square is north of where it is in reality, then maybe you could do that, but they probably wouldn't have the same names now, would they? I don't know. That, like, actually looking at the map and saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not how they got there, was a little bit jarring for me too. So, if you're going to add these details, try to make sure they're accurate. So yeah. Again, full review over at the Wordy Pair Podcast. It's quite long and quite funny and goes into a pretty significant amount of detail. We both had recently read the whole book, and so it's a lot of fun. But I just wanted to talk about this name-dropping technique and mention that awareness of your audience and what they know well is going to be important as to making any kind of name-dropping sound, whether it sounds familiar or whether it sounds like haughty, right? And generally speaking, you don't want to sound haughty to your audience unless you're like taking the perspective of a haughty character in the book. The narrator should not be looking down on people in general if it's just a narrator, so be careful of that. That's my thoughts. Final point is that remember that this still applies to proper nouns of places in pure fiction. For instance, in the book I'm currently finishing up, there's a star system called Dora Vista. I explain a few things about why it's called that, and I describe a little bit about the city that they go to and the space station that they visit. I give a few details, again, between a few words to a couple of sentences for each of these details, so that I don't just say, we went to this star system where you don't know what I'm talking about. And so I provide a little bit of description. But that description is important for real locations too, if your audience is broader than the people who would already know about that area. So that's what I've got for today. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you all next time with, I'm not sure what's next. We'll see. Have a good one.